Tonight's presentation is by Matthew Podolinsky. He's going to be talking about effective signage at rock art sites, what works and what doesn't work in terms of getting visitors to respect sites. I'm actually really interested in this topic. I spent a couple of days 2 weeks ago down at the Rochester Creek site, and I know that was one of the sites that Matthew worked on when he was doing his research. And there's a whole bunch of vandalism down there now at all the sites in that neighborhood. And, you know, I was really curious because about the time that Matthew was doing his work was when the BLM was putting up a lot of the small ARPA signs around sites. And I think they were doing that mostly so that they could prosecute people if there was damage to the site. And I'll be curious to know what his thoughts are on some of that signage and the usefulness of that. But Matthew, I believe it was your master's degree that you were doing when you were working on this. He now works for the National Forest Foundation. I didn't know much about that, so I did a little bit of work. They planted 8 million trees in 2022 and invested almost $18 million in our national forests. So that's pretty impressive. And for many of you know that, you know, our national forests have a lot of rock art in them. So it's nice to know that he's there, and I'm curious to hear what he will talk about tonight. And I'll turn the...
First off, thanks everyone for being here. Good evening. Thanks to ARARA for hosting me tonight. I'm pretty excited to present my master's thesis, which was on site signage, the effect of moral and threat appeals on reducing depreciative behavior at rock art sites. First off, I want to respectfully acknowledge that this study was conducted on the traditional lands of the Ute and Paiute people who have stewarded that area for generations. Also, this area was associated with the Fremont culture and Barrier Canyon areas. And then lastly, thank you to all the agencies, the BLM Utah, the BLM Price Field Office. The Utah State Historic Preservation Office was really integral to my research, and obviously the University of Utah Parks, Recreation, and Tourism Department. But just jumping into kind of the background, I don't need to really go into too much depth on this one as I'm presenting to the American Rock Art Research Association, but just a couple of quick things. Rock art, rock imagery, these are two terms that I'll probably be using interchangeably throughout the presentation. I know that this is kind of changing in the last couple of years. Whether or not you think it's rock art or rock imagery, I just will be using this term interchangeably. But kind of the big thing, rock art is considered special as it is a direct human expression of human concept, thought, and creation. And for indigenous peoples, rock art reflects a link to their ancestors, a connection to the landscape, and is often considered sacred or spiritual. And it still holds direct meaning to modern tribes. Now, due to age, exposure, and medium, rock art is considered fragile, and it is a non-renewable resource. And one of the cool and interesting things about it is found in its original context and location, which makes it very cool to interact with and view and visit. But that makes it really susceptible to human impacts, such as tourism. And as tourism is increasing, this is going to result in more damage. And so we need to find long-term preservation solutions for these rock art sites. As many of you know, there are numerous federal statutes that protect rock art. As we kind of mentioned, the Archaeological Resource Protection Act, ARPA, Antiquities Act. So these are all pertain to the preservation of these locations. And the American Southwest is home to countless rock art sites over a very large area. And many of these agencies that manage them lack the funds or the personnel to protect these sites. So given these facts, it can be proved difficult to manage or protect them. So what do we have to worry about? Obviously lots we need to worry about, but the issue that we're going to be talking about today is depreciative behavior. Depreciative behaviors are actions that degrade park resources or the experiences of other visitors. Depreciative behavior around cultural resources may result in permanent loss of the resource and cultural value. And based on intent, knowledge, and motivation, one can distinguish 6 different types of depreciative behaviors, which are unintentional, release or cue, uninformed, responsibility denial, status confirming, and willful. So just to break down a couple of these, so unintentional depreciative behaviors are often committed by people who have no knowledge whatsoever about the resource, and their actions are unintentionally damaging. Or releaser cue, for instance, that's if someone views or sees existing graffiti, that's a cue for them to potentially add their mark. So it's a releaser cue. So just a couple of those. It's it starts from like the least damaging to into what people mostly know, or the most knowledge that someone has to the most knowledge that someone has. So the first 5 categories correspond to behaviors that damage resources and are done unintentionally. What the people that do these damages, they don't know what they're doing is wrong. They need to be educated. The last category, willful behaviors, are unique and they correspond to vandalism or looting. These are intentional and actors know what they are doing is wrong. I am exploring ways to reduce the first 5 categories. The willful, the vandalism and looting, a sign doesn't really work on these type of people because they know it's wrong. And generally in the research, what is most effective is law enforcement, fines, those kind of aspects. So how do we effectively influence visitors to act in a desired way? One way to influence people is to activate internal norms that result in pro-social behavior. Pro-social or helping behavior refers to a category of behaviors that are voluntary and benefit another without regard for social reinforcement or anticipation of reward. Now, the norm activation theory suggests that norms within people must be triggered or activated to behave in an altruistic way. Once these norms are activated, one feels a sense of moral obligation and acts in a pro-social manner. To help activate these pro-social norms, which I'll go into in the next slide, which are the specific ones, messages should contain awareness of consequences and also ascription of responsibility components. Now, these are relatively descriptive terms, but awareness of consequences are components that make one aware that their actions or inaction have consequences. Ascription of responsibility relates to people knowing that they have responsibility toward another person, an animal, an object, or rock art, and they are accountable for the consequences of their actions or inaction. Moral appeals are designed to activate specific pro-social norms, as I've mentioned, and the ones that are very important to activating are reciprocity and social responsibility. Now, reciprocity norms dictate that one should help those who have helped them and subsequently not harm the person or object that helped them. So in terms of natural or cultural resources or rock art, one should not harm the environment or cultural resources because these resources provide the visitor with happiness and awe. It gives them some satisfaction. Now, the social responsibility norm suggests that people have an obligation to resources or people who are dependent upon others for protection or assistance. In this case, rock art is fragile, it's a non-renewable resource, and it's vulnerable. Therefore, visitors have an obligation to preserve the resource. So just as a quick review of the sign that I designed using the norm activation theory, this is what I put up at my specific site. So I'll just kind of go over it briefly for people who might not be able to read, but somebody is destroying the rock art, looting, excavating underneath the rock imagery, scratching, graffiti, dog urination, standing too close, or even touching can permanently damage these fragile sites. Such actions may damage rock art forever. Excavating may lead to erosion, scratching and graffiti leave permanent marks, urine can corrode the rock itself, breathing on or touching rock art can wear away fragile images. Please respect these cultural sites, stand back, enjoy, and do not deface rock art. Imagine these rock art panels without modern etchings with crisp and clean lines. This can be achieved if everyone practices harmless rock art etiquette. Your actions will help preserve rock art for the enjoyment of current and future generation. Stand back and don't erase the traces of America's past. You'll probably notice a couple familiar lines in that from the ARPA signs that you've probably seen out throughout West. Next slide will kind of show that. But I designed this with a couple other psychologists as it pertains to the norm activation theory and a couple frameworks to actually design a good moral appeal. Okay, so another approach to reducing depreciative behaviors is to frighten the individual into making the right or desired behavior. Fear and threat appeals are powerful tools used to influence individuals, and they're used quite common, used throughout the field pretty commonly. The extended parallel process model and theory explains that a good fear appeal will emphasize the legitimate harmful consequences to someone if someone behaves in an undesired manner. Furthermore, a good fear appeal will provide recommendations to avoid that specific threat. Now, a threat appeal is a weak fear appeal. It's a little confusing, but generally these type of messages may not be scary enough, or they do not provide reasonable means to avoid that threat that is in the message. Now, the Bureau of Land Management currently uses a sign incorporating language from the Archaeological Resource Protection Act. The sign threatens visitors with possible fines and potential arrest if one defaces archaeological resources, such as rock art. So what type of message is this sign? Using the psychological theory, the extended parallel process model, one can demonstrate that the BLM's ARPA sign does not qualify as a true fear appeal. The message fails to create a true fear of prosecution and fines. And in addition, the message fails to educate visitors on proper rock art etiquette, such as don't touch. And so therefore, the ARPA sign is considered is a threat appeal and not a fear appeal, and will be referred to as such throughout the rest of the presentation. This is the example of basically it's the pass sign, but also modified so to reduce the amount of variables in my study. But yeah, basically it has information and verbiage from the Archaeological Resource Protection Act. So this study builds on the results of past research primarily around natural resource settings. While there is significant research around cultural resources and archaeology in and of itself, there's surprisingly little research around the human interaction and the protection of cultural resources, and there's quite a gap in the research. So I had to draw a lot from natural resources, cutting trails, picking up petrified wood, and influencing, but I did find a good one on Civil War battlefield monuments, and also there's been some government reports. But influencing visitors using different approaches has been researched for many decades in the natural resource field. Okay. So the purpose of this study was to design, implement, and assess the effectiveness of moral and threat appeals aimed at reducing depreciative behaviors at rock art sites. So the rock art panel that I chose for my research was the Rochester panel, which Troy mentioned earlier. It's located in the San Rafael Swell in Emery County, Utah. It's a pretty popular site, and this site was chosen upon the recommendation of the Bureau of Land Management Price Field Office. I collected data between March 25th and June 6th of 2021. This period of time was chosen because it is peak visitation for the San Rafael Swell. Several depreciative behaviors were chosen to look for: touching, urination, hitting, graffiti, and etching. I also collected demographic questionnaires. Now, a signpost was installed about 25 yards away from the panel. It seems like it's probably a little bit too far. However, this site was chosen as the cliff band forces visitors to pass by this section of trail, and so you have to pass the sign. There's also a little tiny petroglyph panel right next to it. The research compared 3 conditions: a moral appeal, a threat appeal, and a no message condition. Each condition was randomly assigned 14 days during that trial period. 2 different signs were installed during the moral and threat appeal conditions, and the entire signpost was removed during the no message control. To capture moments of depreciative behavior, a wildlife camera was installed adjacent to the main panel. This camera was concealed as to not influence visitor behavior. The camera was motion triggered and captured a photograph followed by 10 seconds of video footage. The footage was collected on an SD card, and then I uploaded the data to a secure folder. After everything was kind of collected, the two copies of the video footage were made. 2 video coders watched the footage and recorded the number of parties, the numbers of individuals, number of children, number of dogs, and the amount of specific depreciative behaviors, which I mentioned earlier. Each of the coders' results were compared, entered into SPSS to find an inter-rater reliability. It was found that there was actually very good agreement between the coders. The data was averaged and then analyzed. So just kind of some of the fun things of working in the field, loading up the truck, and then going to the Rochester panel, which you can see right there. I saw where I collected demographic questionnaires, and you might look at the picture on the right and think, what the heck is that? But that is a nice mouse butt. Saw lots of critters in front of that wildlife camera, so I had to go through a lot of midnight stuff when I'm seeing a lot of critters go up and around. If you haven't been to San Rafael Swell, I recommend it. It's a great place to view rocket imagery, but the area is just phenomenal. And I experienced a lot of what camping in the desert was like in the spring, had some good times, and waking up to some really wintry times as well. So never a dull moment. Okay, the results. The demographic questionnaire collected during the research period showed that the average visitor was likely a married, white, middle-aged Utah male who has a 4-year degree and earns between $50,000 and $150,000 annually. It should be known that this data was collected in early 2021, so it was during the pandemic. This probably would change if it was conducted today. A total of 2,316 videos were collected, which is about 6 hours and 26 minutes of data. 259 parties were observed with a total of 638 individuals. 80% of these parties were without children. There were no instances of urination or graffiti. The main depreciative behavior observed was touching. 47% of parties engaged in touching the panel. To summarize the statistical results, during the moral appeal intervention, there were fewer touches than during the threat or no message control. Surprisingly, there were more touches during the threat appeal intervention than the no message control period. 9 instances of hitting occurred and 1 moment of etching. There's not enough data to statistically analyze these 2 independent variables. However, we are going to be discussing it because they are considered quite destructive in their nature, especially the etching period. So the results indicate that the moral appeal messaging can significantly lower the amount of depreciative behaviors at rock art sites. Specifically, the statistical results demonstrate that visitor touching of rock art can be reduced. According to the mean number of touches, the moral appeal condition resulted in 47.7% fewer touches than the control condition and 49.6% fewer touches than the threat appeal or the ARPA condition. This is significant because according to the video footage, touching is the most common form of depreciative behavior. And as you know, while a single touch does not seemingly damage rock art, a substantial number of touches can permanently dephase rock imagery. 9 instances of hitting did occur during the research period. And while there isn't technically enough data to statistically analyze around hitting only, 1.9% of parties hit the panel during the moral appeal period, 3.4% of parties hit the panel during the threat appeal, and 4.5% of parties hit the panel in a no message control. You're probably wondering what exactly hitting means. Touching is one thing. Hitting is generally touching the rock art with something other than your body or hands. So putting your boot on it or taking your hiking pole and putting it on it. Generally, that is what we described as a hit. Okay. 1 instance of etching occurred during the research period. You can see the message that was scratched on the petroglyph from this picture. The important information for this study is that the etching occurred during the no message control condition. Therefore, the depreciative behavior occurred during a time when there was no message, there was nothing present to educate visitors on any level, which may demonstrate that any type of signage that agencies put out has an effect on reducing the most severe depreciative behaviors. It's an interesting one to see for sure, like don't give up. This was at the height of the pandemic. Very interesting thing to write over a petroglyph. I believe that they're still researching what's going on with this one. Okay. I feel like I missed one. Nope. Okay. Another way to explain the results is by pointing out the failures of the threat appeal. Remarkably, there were more touches during the threat appeal than during the no message control. Why? One explanation is that visitors rejected the message because they were in the fear control process. When visitors fail to understand the severity of the punishment and do not feel they are susceptible to said punishment, then, according to the extended parallel process model, the individual goes into what is called the fear control process. This may lead to a variety of outcomes, including rejection of the message and engaging in depreciative behaviors. Another explanation is that the ARPA message has lost its influence or its power. This particular sign narrative has been in use since the 1990s, and visitors may not process the message because it has become too familiar. If this is the case with the current BLM ARPA sign, then visitors do not register the message because the signs simply aren't worth reading. This implies that the threat appeal ARPA message currently used by the BLM has little, if not worse, effect at reducing touching behaviors at rock art sites as opposed to no message at all. So implications for some research. There is surprisingly little research around cultural resource damage. Future research can focus on an assortment of solutions to reduce depreciative behaviors as well as vandalism and theft. I recommend researching other theories and designs around indirect messaging as a solution to reducing depreciative behaviors. For example, future research should design a true fear appeal and explore how effective that is. Also, what are other ways to make signage more effective? Future research can build on itself and use different colors, wordage, photos. There's a lot of signs out there right now around Bears Ears. It's great. The Greater Bears Ears Partnership does an amazing job. Let's research to see if we can even improve those, stuff like that. Lastly, I researched the effectiveness of moral and threat appeals on one rock art site. Future research should test my message on other rock art locations across Utah, the nation, and actually internationally. It would be fascinating to learn how effective it is at other locations. And furthermore, moral appeal messaging should be tested at other cultural resources, such as historic or prehistoric sites as well outside of rock art. I believe that a lot of signs should be specific to the resource itself. So there should be a rock art sign, there should be a historic cabin sign, just because those the impacts are very different to those different resources. And all I can really say is that this field is very ripe for research. Now, implications for practice. And what you can take away from this presentation is this research shows that signs should be purposely designed to reduce depreciative behaviors. Furthermore, I would argue that the message should be designed with the specific resource in mind. I argue that the effectiveness of the sign is also due to the fact that it was specific to rock imagery. People interact differently with different cultural resources, as I mentioned earlier. So signs should be specific. This research demonstrated that the current ARPA message sign has little effect and surprisingly led to more depreciative behaviors, specifically touching. Land managers should seriously reconsider seriously consider replacing these signs. I'm not saying that they should remove the ARPA message. ARPA is very important for cultural resource management, and it allows law enforcement to prosecute individuals who destroy rock art, which was a great way to start this whole presentation off with looking for the lawyer. I suggest land managers design signs incorporating awareness of consequences and a description of responsibility components that educate visitors with an ARPA message stating what the law is. Replacing signs will demonstrate to visitors that the site is also being maintained and it is being cared for. Show that the agency is paying attention to these sites. As mentioned earlier, 2 government reports have been published in the last 2 decades. Both suggest that research is necessary to understand negative impacts to cultural resources. The government is stating that there simply is a gap in the literature, and as such, land use agencies and universities should encourage and fund future research into the study of cultural resource damage and explore practical solutions. And while this research was conducted in Utah, I believe that this will have practical implications throughout the US and Canada. Heritage tourism is increasing, and this should be something that is researched. Furthermore, this is just one side of visitor use management around cultural resources. And we should look into other indirect management approaches, education, law enforcement, and public engagement, and more stewardship. In conclusion, rock art is a fragile and a non-renewable resource that is considered unique due to its ability to embody beliefs, stories, art, language, and culture. Rock art is one of humankind's most enduring forms of art, representing the relationship between people and landscapes. These sites are culturally, spiritually, and religiously significant to indigenous peoples. And unlike artifacts in museums, the location of rock art enables people to view this prehistoric art in its original setting. For these reasons, it is essential that rock art is protected and preserved. Studying and researching interventions and prevention measures is necessary in order to reduce damage or the permanent loss of the rock art. I hope that the results from this thesis research will help inform land use agencies and others to develop effective signage that will lead to the long-term preservation of rock art. I'll just quickly jump over to my last acknowledgement before I take some questions, but I do want to thank all my committee members, Edward Reddell, Dorothy Dart-Smaltz, and Elizabeth Hora, who's with the SHPO. All the agencies that I mentioned. I had several volunteers help me collect demographic data, and I also got to bring my dog out every once in a while just because, yeah, she loves the desert and everything like that. And also thanks to my partner as well for definitely supporting out. So, okay.
Thank you very much, Matthew. That was great.
Perfect. Cool. And I can open up my slide again in case people want to look at anything too. So
Sure. We did have several questions. Also, several people just said, great talk. They really enjoyed it.
yeah.
So several questions popped up when you showed the sign that you had devised. And a few people commented that it seemed very lengthy. It was a lot to read, and wondered, is there a way to condense that down, whether breaking it up into multiple signs or using more symbols rather than words? Any thoughts on maybe making that, because obviously someone's walking to a site, they don't want to stop and necessarily read that much.
Oh yeah, wholeheartedly agree with everybody who had that question that it is a wordy, long sign. Just because of the norm activation theory that I chose and the framework that the psychologist recommended, that was the reason why it was so wordy. I think that to make the sign better, it should be condensed. I think that pretty much listing or just saying like don't touch rock art, that's kind of a baseline in my opinion, like where it's like if you're saying don't touch rock art, pretty much anything after that probably it's assumed can be like you shouldn't hit it with your pole or do anything else like that. So I think that you can really reduce it down into a much more simple sign. However, we'd have to look into that because we do want to keep that moral aspect, make people feel that they are morally responsible for their actions and everything that does occur. But I think you can reduce it.
Right. And what about the idea of using icons or something like that as opposed to just wordage? Sometimes that people will catch that, an image saying, showing someone don't touch this or whatever it might be. The other thing people ask about is what about other languages besides English?
Yeah.
So I know that would increase more signage, but
it creates more signage. Obviously, this study was conducted in Utah and it was just in English. Definitely, I don't see why not, like why you couldn't have other languages. I think it would work very similarly. I would say that norms are different in every culture, so that's kind of an interesting aspect. So if you are conducting this study and using moral appeals, let's just say Mexico, they might have different norms that might need to be activated if you're going with the norm activation theory. But I wouldn't see why a different language wouldn't be effective.
Right. Somebody also mentioned that they're site stewards in a public park, and they struggle with writing signage, not just about rock art, but stay on the trails, pick up after your dog. Of course, don't leave graffiti. They mentioned in France seeing signs which were much more positive, things like this is where wildlife lives, nature and plants grow, things like that. What are your thoughts about instead of all the don'ts, what are the positive ways that you can influence people?
I am a big believer in that. That's another reason why like I'm not a big fan of fear or threat appeals. I really like those positive ways to educate people, and that's why at the end of mine it says, imagine this rock imagery with clear and crisp lines in this beautiful area without blemishes. Like those are always, I think people do respond pretty well to that, and most people will. It leaves people with a better taste in their mouth for visiting from the site itself, but also even from the agency trying to educate them. They're like, oh, this is great. Like their agency is wanting us to have a good time and enjoy this in a more meaningful manner. So I did a couple of the my citations are from studies that do look into more positive approaches, or even looking into designing signs with more colors that are more pleasant to look at. And that'll draw people into, I guess to go into that a little bit, the signs are, beige, they blend in, stuff like that. That's only that it took from the color of the current BLM sign. But I think to make a better sign, you do need something that people want to read and also is pleasant to look at.
Right. Some people talked about the current ARPA signs. One thing you notice on those signs, it doesn't mention touching on those signs. It mentions destruction. So people say, well, it doesn't say I can't do it. So, yeah.
As my partner will tell you, I have a big issue with the ARPA signs. Obviously, I worked with it for quite a while. Once again, very important. I don't think that they work at all, because I think that for depreciative behaviors, because just the word deface it's vague. What does that mean? If you've never interacted with rock art, like, of course I'm originally from Montana. I know a lot of people who I went to Rochester panel with friends, and the first thing that they did was touch the panel because it's a line and you want to put your fingers in it. So that's something that really does need to be spelt out, and people hopefully will understand if they read the sign.
Right. Did you have any opportunity to discuss the signs with the designers of the ARPA signs, or anyone who had been part of that process previously?
I had a hard time finding who designed that sign. I did find somebody, and I'm going to space his name out. I think his last name Christensen. He was able to tell me that it was designed in the 90s, but he had no idea where it came from, like when it came or where it just all of a sudden just appeared around. I've presented this a similar presentation to BLM Utah. I was at the Society of American Archaeology conference, and so I'm hoping that kind of stuff will reach some more people. We've made several copies of this sign, or the State Historic Preservation Office made 50 of these signs, and they've given them out to the National Park Service, the BLM, and the Forest Service here in Utah, in the hopes that they'll be used. But I'm hoping that eventually this information will get up to the bigger office to make better signs for ARPA.
And did you, apart from just signage, which I know was the focus of your research, but did you look into the difference when, even something as simple as a very low barrier in front, keeping people back from the art, whether it's a row of rocks or a, very short fence, not something really intrusive, but just a way to say, hey, don't walk right up to it.
I actually, that was one of the things, like if I go get my PhD, that's something that I would be interested in looking at. One of the interesting things about that is having signs do the same thing, but having a low barrier for some people, like, takes away from the experience. And it's kind of it's infrastructure, you can see it. And also, if it's a site that is close to a road but not very well known, putting up a little tiny sign around it may be enough to encourage people to build a trail. So that was like, we had my advisors and I, we just had some good conversations about what are like those type of, like, are those effective? Should they be in place for more popular sites? Definitely. Even like the Rochester panel, it's a popular enough site, but for people who have been the Rochester panel, it is really cool to go up there, and it's beautiful. You're right on that bluff, you're out on that point, and there's nothing between you and the panel. And I think everybody here can understand that it's really quite cool to have that. But the more popular the site, maybe that type of infrastructure is needed.
Right. Someone mentions that Friends of Sierra Rock Art on the Tahoe National Forest, they've placed ammo boxes containing site behavior and information about the site. Have you seen similar things, or did you look into that kind of way of signage?
Yeah, I did. Not a lot of, there's really no research on the effectiveness of ammo boxes with crayons or, you know, pamphlets in it, or how effective those are. Obviously, people are going to open them up. And I remember, I think Natural Bridges has one that I saw once where it's like, don't draw on the rock art, draw on this piece of paper. Which I think is a great idea. I think it's really thinking outside the box, or the ammo can. But an issue that I might potentially have, or one thing that I thought about in the past, is you're giving somebody a tool at those, which might be a risk. However, I don't know if if you could compare those, if it would be more effective than having a sign. So
someone also mentioned that a lot of vandalism seems to involve alcohol, and as well as with ARPA signage, sometimes there's an anti-government sentiment. Did you look into any of that in your research?
I saw that a little bit. Vandalism, theft, graffiti, it generally does happen, you know, around a party vibe, alcohol. Just because that is vandalism and willful type behavior, the only reason, like, a sign is not going to work against somebody who's drunk. They're going to shoot it. As we've all seen ARPA signs with a bunch of bullets written out through them. There is some research that shows that if you put an American flag on certain things, people won't shoot it, or a kiosk, stuff like that. That doesn't really help the rock art. It just helps the sign to stay in place. So that's just kind of an aside. So generally for alcohol signs, like, yeah, people who are drunk or gonna commit vandalism or graffiti, the signs aren't really gonna do anything. They're just kind of, yeah, gonna get shot up along with the rock art, unfortunately.
Right. And a couple of people mentioned, what about the idea of putting QR codes on the signs, or something to do with site-specific information?
Yeah, that's something that I think is coming around. I've seen it in the national parks. You know, you might need to have a phone. You might need to have, sometimes it'll pull up, sometimes it won't. So that's kind of, you could probably have a sign with the QR code. I don't see why that wouldn't be at all bad. I think you could probably take it even a step further, is have an ARPA interpretive sign, or, like, you know, have the moral appeal with the ARPA with the QR code, and then the QR code would bring up, you know, protect and respect messaging, but then give you interpretation, or, you know, a quick educational thing about rock art. It might, because you can't really interpret rock art sometimes, but, you know, I think it's a great place that, you know, research and interpretation could go. Right.
And the other thing, as far as information, what about information either directly from Indigenous people, or at least concerning what the value of this is to Indigenous people as well as the greater population?
Yeah, if that could be included on anything, I think that'd be great. I did, when I was beginning the study, I did want to include more of the Native perspectives and stuff like that. I was kind of discouraged a little bit, because it was my master's and they were like, just get this information out. PhD might look into it. It's not great, I know, but I think that is like definitely a place that it should go and needs to go, is that Native voice is incredibly important. It is essential to these. And that's an interesting thing, actually. And I mentioned this in my paper, is in some cultures, obliteration is part of their culture, which I kind of say, like, I'm not approaching that. I'm not touching that. Some people might see it as vandalism, but that's something very different that I don't touch at all. But that's an interesting aspect about bringing in some of the Native voice and stuff like that, is there's a lot of different views, a lot of different perspectives, and a lot of people who call this place home. So.
And Linnea has her hand raised. I believe she has a question. I know she's worked on similar issues with backpack tags and all sorts of things. So
yeah,
do you want to just ask your question?
Oh, great paper, Matthew. I am so glad you're doing this research. I can't even tell you. So this might be one for your PhD. But one of the issues I've run into in doing management plans and so forth is where to place the sign. And so at one point, there is one site that's pretty well known, but it's rugged to get to. So the agency had placed the ARPA sign right in front of where the rock art was. And I felt like it was leading to more vandalism, particularly more digging, because then it's like, oh, here's the spot. And they eventually did go to putting the signs more on the entrance points, like things that you'd have to pass by to get to the rock art site. But it did come up in a court case that, well, there was no sign there, so I didn't know I wasn't supposed to carve my name. Well, that didn't fly with a federal judge, I can assure you of that. But it's something I'm wondering if you looked at in either your literature search or in your experiments that you did.
Well, first off, thank you. I actually recognize your name. I think I cited you in my paper, and I think there's another person on the call too that I cited. But so thank you for the question. From what I can remember, I can't recall anything about the placement of that, but that was definitely considered about where to put the sign, because for what I mentioned in my thing is like I placed it 25 yards away, and the only reason was because people had to go by that. Where if it was a little bit closer, the trails spider all over the place, and maybe people would have recognized it as a protection message and just walked around it without actually looking at it. I don't know. I think that's a really interesting thing to study. I think that should be studied, is where is the most effective, or where will most people read it, because generally, at a general parking area with a kiosk with many different trails, some people read it, some people won't. I don't know the answer exactly, but I think that's an interesting thing to study, one of the gaps in research as well. So sorry I didn't answer the question very well, but
no, it's just something to think about. I think with kiosks, sometimes you're anxious to get going and see the thing, and there's too much information on that kiosk. So you might look at it after you get back, because now what you don't know.
Yeah. And always the issue is, like with any type of sign, some people read, some people don't. We go out hiking, and I'm one of those people that will read every interpretive panel, and and my partner doesn't. They're just like, let's get to the viewpoint, let's go, and I'll like regurgitate everything I see, but like they're not one to ever read stuff, and that's gonna be, unfortunately, everybody.
Yeah, and somebody pointed that out in the chat about sometimes museums have two level of signage, one very surface level for people who are just walking by and will glance at it, and another one that goes into more depth, the idea of doing kind of two level of signage.
I think just as another, outside of like the thesis and doing scientific research around this, I think a good sign would have pictures that would show a before and after of, a beautiful rock imagery, and then what happens after someone vandalized it or erected. I think that's very visual. Everyone's going to understand it. It's like, that sucks. And then description after that, and definitely don't touch and stuff like that. So I think, those two levels of like, there's visual, and then there's people who read, so everything like that. That'd be important.
And how much does a sign cost to put up?
It's going to be very different per sign. I want to say that the 50 signs that were my signs that we got for SHPO after that, I guess like the individual signs, how much is that? I think it was like $50 for, I got 4 signs. Like, so I had a backup sign in case it did get shot up. So I had 4 signs made, and I think it was $50. And then, the more signs you make, you might get deals and everything like that. But it kind of depends on how beautiful you want it or all stuff. Like, so for instance, I'm going through the process of just getting an interpretive wayfinding map now for the National Forest Foundation. I'm getting 3 of these made, and it's going to cost $3,500. So kind of depends on what size and how detailed you're looking.
Sure, sure. And someone also suggests the idea of signage to make people more interactive with the site. You could say things like, help us with our research, or, you know, here's a photo spot, stand here to get the perfect photo, something like that.
Yeah, I don't see that as a problem, as long as it's not obviously getting too interactive and touching, or
Right.
There's an interesting article even the other day that like there's just certain things that you probably shouldn't put on the signs, like and I'm sure a lot of people have a lot of opinions about this, but like asking the question, what does it mean? I'm sure some of you have read this paper, like asking what does it mean or all this stuff. Maybe you shouldn't ask that on an interpretive panel or a sign, because it's taking away what people have studied / away from definitely the Native Americans and what they do. So I think that's really important. I'm down for interaction, being like, take your picture here, you know, direct people to behave in the best way. So I think that's a great idea.
And someone points this out, and this is always, the question seems to come up in vandalism cases, but the difference between indigenous rock art and graffiti. Sometimes people think, well, someone else carved something, I can carve something. Obviously, we know graffiti begets graffiti, but how do we deal with that in educating the public?
Great question. I'm probably not going to be able to answer that fully, because you know, there's historic graffiti on a lot of these rock imagery as well, which sometimes it's hard. Like, I think to the general public, that's going to be much harder to be able to discern if is it historic or is it modern. Probably a lot of us here on this call, like, we're going to be able to probably tell, we're like, oh, that's a very fresh mark, or I haven't seen that, stuff like that. So I think that's going to be a really tough call on whether or not to see whether or not it's historic or not. So I don't really fully know on that, like how to discern on stuff like that. Maybe it is to have a picture of, you know, the panel, and just kind of show, you know, zoomed in pictures, and it would show what is there. And if something's new, you know, you can say that, oh, that's a new piece of graffiti that someone I don't know. Sorry, I went on a tangent, but I kind of lost that one actually as I kept on going.
Sure.
But
very hard question to answer. So
yeah, it's a very complicated question. I don't know. It'll be interesting. I think one of the biggest things also is just like education, starting at the young level, starting at you know, with the general public, on teaching these different means to interact and what is the best way to interact with rock art. As a kind of a cool story, there's a really cool panel by Moab that's pretty popular that has historic graffiti over, you know, the petroglyph, and a lot of the historic graffiti is like this cursive writing of people of big, like, historic families of Moab that are still, like, their families are still in Moab. They go to school, and we're trying to get school groups to come up and tour this area. And it's a really cool learning opportunity to be like, hey, that's your family name. Let's talk about historic graffiti and settler era, and then beforehand, and then kind of show like, oh, our way of changing has, you know, our thought process has changed. We don't do that anymore. We don't leave our mark in this way because it is disrespectful. So I just say, like, that's a harder thing to discern with the releaser cues and other graffiti, but just education on a larger level will probably teach that, but it's always going to happen, unfortunately.
Well, I don't want to end on a down note, but but I think that's great. That kind of covered most of our questions. Really enjoyed your presentation. A lot to think about. Really important things, you know, dealing with signage. And I can also make sure that I send you the chat. There's been lots of comments and stuff that I haven't been able to relay to you, but I'll make sure you get that.
Perfect.
In the future
yeah.
as well.
Thanks again. I'll just say, like, on a positive note, like I said, there's a gap in the research. There's a lot we can learn, which is pretty exciting. You know, and I think that people are getting more into visitor use management, how to interact with people and the resource. And so I think that's a really cool aspect. If people do want to reach out, if they have questions or do want a copy of the paper, I don't know if you'll send that out to folks, but matt. Podolinsky, P as in Paul. I guess you can read it on my screen, but Matt.Podolinsky, P as in Paul, ODOLINSKY@gmail.com.
Sure. And Matthew, if you don't mind, if you want to put that in the chat.
Oh yeah, that's
you have a moment. People can see that before they log off.
Of course.
But thank you for saying that. And with that, again, I just want to thank you very much. Really enjoyed your talk. We'll be back again next month in December with Charles Koenig talking about the rock art of the Grable South site in Wyoming. So until then, thank you all very much. And thank you, Matthew.